Welcome back to another episode of the Sacred Giggle podcast. As always, this is your host, Ashish, aka Shishi, aka the Brownest Bear. My guest on the show today is Blaise DeAngelo. Blaise is a Vedic meditation teacher, a former music executive and DJ, the former head of OWSLA, one of the most influential electronic music labels in history, and the founder of Arete, a wellness conference that takes place at IMS Ibiza every year in the spring. He is an incredibly inspiring guy who has had many careers. He's lived many lives in his young life thus far, and his most recent reincarnation as a meditation teacher is one that personally really inspires me. His commitment to embodying truth and being of service on this planet and using his energy for the betterment of society and humanity is truly commendable. And especially the way that he got there is really inspiring. And I think is going to be really insightful for a lot of the people that listen to this show. You know, people like me who are artists, people who want to make a positive difference. Blaise is really somebody who is leading with his heart first and living in accordance with nature and in alignment with his path so that he can really be of service. And I think that's what we all are deeply craving. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this beautiful conversation with Blaise James. Just to give people some context and background, you started this year off in a really, really special way, you know, after having had a lot of success and having had a lot of impact in the world of dance music, being the head of OWSLA alongside Skrillex, one of the most influential labels in the game. And then, you know, just really having a lot of success in the industry and then switching gears and really fully committing to this path to become a Vedic meditation teacher. And I would definitely want to get into like the motivations for all that and stuff. But before we get there, the common thread that I've noticed just watching the way you work, whether it was, I mean, I didn't know you at the time, but, you know, just from the fact that you had a lot of success with OWSLA or the work that you're doing at Gwyn or how you've set up Arete at IMS and Ibiza. And now the way that it seems that you're approaching your meditation career, your career as a meditation coach, I notice a really common thread of just fully committing to the thing that's in front of you, which I find really admirable as somebody who maybe you can relate is also very into a lot of different things and sometimes has trouble figuring out what I should be spending my focus on. And I end up doing a mediocre job at everything instead of just like doing really good job at one thing. So I'm curious, like, I mean, is that something that you struggle with also as someone that's had your hand in a lot of things, or do you feel like it's just kind of your nature to focus really intensely on one thing at a time?
Well, first of all, thank you. I mean, I appreciate that, like to hear really genuine praise like that from someone like you who, is someone who really inspires me. It means a lot and I appreciate it. I appreciate you kind of taking notice. It's funny, like I was just thinking about that the other day. I was having a conversation with a friend at dinner and it just kind of occurred to me like in my subconscious, I've kind of been through a lot of different phases. I mean, without even getting into like who I was in, high school, college, things like that. As far as my professional career, I started off working at Groove Shark, a streaming service in like a post Napster era when streaming was still like a new thing, before Spotify was, the dominant sort of force, before Apple Music even existed. And like that was my life. And then I, got linked up with Skrillex and the OWSLA crew. And then for 6 or 7 years, that was my life. There was a time in there after that where I was just sort of traveling and trying to find myself. And then that was my life. There was a time during those years where I was doing some consulting for Richie Houghton, various different, European based artists. And then techno was my life. There was, I guess, a lot of different stuff that I've sort of thrown myself into. And yeah, it didn't really occur to me at the time that I was throwing myself into it, right? I think it's just like when I'm doing something and I'm putting my name on it, like I want it to be great. I want people who look at it, like maybe it's narcissism or whatever, but I think it's also just pride in what I do. And if I'm going to put my name on something and if I'm going to do something, then I care about it, and I want it to be great. And I'll be up all night, working on the website, which is another thing that I randomly got into at some point over the years is, making websites. And I'll be up all night, obsessing over the design and the photography and the language, every aspect of the thing. And I guess that's, I mean, I appreciate you, kind of noticing it, but I guess that's what people see as, throwing myself into something. It's just because I care. And I guess I care because I try to, live my life by a code of only working on stuff that I care about. It's just so much easier when you're working on stuff that you care about, because you want to get out of bed in the morning and you want to work on it and you're excited to work on it.
Yeah, I mean, the word that's popping into my head that encapsulates this is like engagement, right? Like it's just like a deep engagement and immersion with the thing in front of you. Have you struggled with, because like I agree with everything you're saying, and for me, like music is kind of like that, but I also really struggle with resistance towards just like even getting in front of Ableton and a lot of like doubts and things like that. Has that been something that you've faced up against in terms of like all these different things that you've worked on? I mean, I definitely want to spend a good amount of time talking about the teacher training that you did at the beginning of this year, because I know that was a huge undertaking that probably came with a whole host of thoughts about it. But yeah, just in terms of like, I'm kind of just thinking from a listener's perspective, because I think from the outside, someone could look at your career and be like, that guy, like, basically has just been like crushing it in all these things, and it's like, I want to kind of give people a sense, like, have you have faced that resistance? And if so, like, how have you sort of dealt with that, even if it's something that you're really passionate about?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we've had so many great conversations about the power of vulnerability, and I've always known you as someone who is very, very unapologetically and authentically vulnerable with yourself, and that's always been inspiring to me. Like, you don't take yourself too seriously, you don't think you're too cool, you're not afraid to sort of, share those vulnerable moments. So I'll level with you, right? Like, I think a lot of the effort that I put into things and what ends up making me successful at those things is, yeah, a lot of it comes from a place of like, fuck, like, do I even know what I'm doing? Do I even belong here? Right? Like imposter syndrome to the max. Like, what are people going to think? And I'm imagining, like people, my friends, my enemies, people who used to bully me in elementary school, like, subconsciously, you're like, how is this going to be received? And it's probably not the healthiest way to look at it, but I'd be lying, and I think most people would be lying if they said there's not at least a part of that going through their minds when they're working on something, right? Is like, you want to prove, that you belong there. You want to prove, like, oh man, look at what Blaise did. Yeah, I mean, who knew? Like, he's a meditation teacher now. Like, oh right, but he's actually great. Like, my friend learned from him, and she actually had a great experience, and so that's really important to me. So yeah, it's about, I guess it's about using that. I mean, you called it resistance. I think you mentioned the word fear as well. I think everyone has fear, bro. I mean, even the biggest artists in the world who are playing the biggest stages, they're nervous as hell before they're performing. And you have to use that. It's because we care, and you have to use that to motivate you. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's so helpful. I mean, for me personally to hear, and I know a lot of people, that's really empowering to hear, just to hear this perspective that it's not about getting over the fear or finding a way to get rid of the resistance or suddenly like just feeling like you belong. It's as long as you're aware of the process and it's not sabotaging you and leading you to do things that are unconsciously do things that are not aligned for you, then you can use it. Because I know for myself, like, it's funny you mentioned the word belonging, because and I think we talked about this when we were in Ibiza a couple months ago for IMS. We had that really long dinner that was basically like an epic, like 3-hour podcast that I wish we recorded.
That was a great dinner, man. That pasta, that
Oh
ravioli
my
that we had
gosh.
there was so
So
fire.
good. Yeah, that was an incredible, incredible ravioli and incredible dinner tend to go hand in hand. And I remember us talking about this theme of belonging, which has been a huge thing for me as well. Like growing up, I mean, people know my story, but growing up, like as a kid of first generation immigrants, getting bullied a little bit here in the States and going to all these international schools in all these different countries and having a name that was hard to pronounce. Like, and I've seen how all those early childhood experiences kind of influenced a lot of the things that drive me. Like, and it's funny because I think I almost went, like, I also really care about doing good quality work. But my like fear of not belonging kind of manifested itself a little bit differently, I think, where I went to this place where I was like, I just am going to be such a unique artist and be like such a one of one that it doesn't matter that I don't belong anywhere, because like I'm just going to create my own world that like, and then people will come to me kind of thing. And I don't need to like make music to sound like this label or that label. And I think that at that point in my life, like that was a really healthy phase to kind of go through and realization to have. But it's always like a balance, because the shadow side of that is like you can get so kind of isolated in your own world that I know that for me, like I underestimated my desire for just like basic human connection. It's like, just because it, like, for example, to use the label example, like if you're making a certain type of music to get onto a certain type of label, it doesn't necessarily just mean that like you don't have your own artistic identity and like you're insecure because you want to belong. Like it also might just be because you love the community of that label and you want to be a part of it. And I think it seems like from the way that you're describing, with all the things that you've done, it's kind of like you found things that really inspired you and then just had this attitude of like, how can I help? Like, how can I get in here and like do the best job for this project? And that's really inspiring because, like I said just now, I know my default has sometimes been to like withdraw and just be like, oh, I'm just going to do my own thing, which I think is something a lot of artists can probably relate to,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of about wanting to fit in. It's part of our tribal biological sort of desire. We're wired for connection, right? I mean, Johann Hari has a series of brilliant books about connection. He's doing some really interesting work in the field of addiction and pioneering this idea that the opposite of addiction is actually not sobriety, it's actually connection. And also Richard Barrett, who's an incredible, life coach, has a series of books as well that articulate and underscore the importance of human connection in our day-to-day life, and when it comes to happiness and fulfillment, it's really one of the most important things. So I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of when it comes to wanting to fit in, wanting to be part of a tribe, wanting to be part of a community. And I think that what I would say is, there's a community and a tribe for everyone, right? Wanting to fit in and wanting to be part of a community or tribe doesn't mean that we have to dilute who we are or try to be someone else to try to fit into some mold, right? Is, as you just said, we can be exactly who we are, and like, our people will find us, or we'll find them, like we'll run into them in some way. And then you're just going to be so much happier because you have, a bunch of like-minded people. I think we've all gone through, I mean, in my life, man, like let's see how far back I can go. In middle school, I was really into rap, and I used to wear like Sean John and Rockaware and stuff, and like lugs, shoes, and dress kind of hip hop. And then in high school, I went into like a screamo emo phase, and I used to like straighten my hair and wear girl pants and like 3 belts and stuff. And then I went to like an Abercrombie and Fitch, like Hollister phase. And I used to work at those stores and have like a long, like surf haircut. And like that was my identity. And then in college, I was in a fraternity, right? So like that becomes a big part of your identity. And then after that, I was working at the streaming service, which was like a tech startup, right? So then that was my identity. Is like I started wearing like, Tom's loafers and like drinking, expensive coffee and all that kind of stuff, band shirts and tight jeans and stuff like that. And then working with Skrillex, right? Then my identity was that, right? The notorious, all black sort of like dance music, outfit, uniform. And then it's so interesting, right? Because now I find myself like, now I'm a meditation teacher. And so the idea is, on the surface, right? It's easy to fall into this like, oh, well, I should look and act and be kind of like I see other meditation teachers and spiritual teachers and gurus sort of dressing and acting and being. But the difference now is that I've done a lot of work in the many years since I was last part of an organization, and it was quite difficult, walking away from the OWSLA label in 2017 and kind of just being on my own for really since then. I mean, I've done a whole bunch of different consulting things, but I haven't really been part of an organization or worked for anyone or been, wholly identified with any one thing since then. And the first year or two of that was incredibly uncomfortable, right? There were times where it felt like I was flying, like I had jumped off this mountain and I was flying. And there were other times it felt like I was falling with this full force of gravity towards the face of the earth with no safety net. And that was because what I realized what was happening is that I was learning how to disconnect my sense of identity from these external organizations and reconnect it to myself internally, right? And so at first, before I made that reconnection, it was difficult, right? It was almost kind of like, well, who am I? Because I'm not the OWSLA guy anymore. I'm not the, Groove Shark guy anymore, the fraternity guy anymore, the sports guy anymore. Like all these other identities and masks that I had worn through my life. So it was very difficult, but very necessary and very rewarding to go through that practice of sort of like recalibrating who I am to be something to come from inside. And now that I've done that, I don't trip about, well, what should a meditation teacher dress like? Like how should I act? What should I, do? Because I don't think of myself as a meditation teacher now. I'm kind of just me, and I don't really think about any of that stuff.
Yeah, totally, man. I mean, that's so inspiring. And it's like exactly in line with my intentions as an artist. And even that word is like a step too far, because it's like, then that has all its connotations. And it's like, well, what kind of artist? And like, and then you start going back into that rabbit hole. And it's funny that the way you described it, I think makes a lot of sense and feels really right, because I was even on your website a few minutes ago before we started chatting, just kind of looking at the way that you were explaining Vedic meditation and your offerings to people, which I'll put all that in the links of the show. But it felt like nobody else could have written that but you. It was like, if Blaise became a meditation teacher, this would be his website. There are like analogies to music and like how like Vedic meditation is like, if all the other types are like the lo-fi streaming services. It felt like you offering something rather than just being just another meditation teacher, So I think that's really, really inspiring. Is there anything that comes to mind? I mean, I know this is like a big question, but in terms of your own process, what was actually that process of reconnecting to your internal compass, we could call it, or locus of control? Because, I think what you said conceptually can make sense to a lot of people, but then maybe someone's listening and they're like, wow, they just had a moment of revelation hearing you talk. And they're like, I just feel like I've completely invested my identity in this external thing and I actually don't know who I am. Like, where does someone who's in that position start?
Well, you're right. That is a big question, my friend. But
Yeah.
I can answer it very simply nowadays. And the answer is one word, and that's meditation. When we meditate, when we dip into that place of being, right? Not doing, but being. We're human beings, we're not human doings. And I think especially in the West, we are so conditioned to define ourselves by like what we've accomplished lately, or like who we're associated with, or what people have posted our stuff on Instagram, or all those kinds of things. And that's just going to perpetuate the idea that we are anything but ourselves. If you ask someone who they are, they're going to tell you their name and their age and where they were born and what school they went to and their marital status and all these things. Like those are just like boxes on a tax form. Like none of those things are who we are. But people, and myself included, until I got serious about my meditation practice and was able to de-excite my mind and kind of step beyond the daily static of all these things happening around us and stresses and things I have to do and external identifications. It's hard. It's hard to know yourself, but we're not any of those things. Those things are just stories. We're not our bodies, right? Because the body's every 7 years, every cell in our body replenishes itself, right? So how could we possibly be our bodies? We're not any of those things. And I can't really describe like a step-by-step process of how to do it other than, sit with yourself, right? Sit with yourself and quiet the mind. And, as my website kind of says, like words can't really explain it. It is an experience that you have to have for yourself.
Yeah. And another thing on your website that I really resonated with and I thought was funny because I was so relatable to my path as well was you're talking about like, I was trying all these things. Like I tried everything under the sun, like, whatever modality it might be. And I mean, I think there's a reason there's so many modalities because there's a lot of different types of people and, depending on what you believe about people's karma or whatever it is, like people resonate with different things at different points in their time. So it's all beautiful that we have, and we have access to all that information for the first time ever, which is also amazing. But I had a chuckle out of that because for me as well, there really is no substitute for just sitting with yourself. And it's the thing that people will try to avoid the most. You can use other practices because a practice is really still just giving you something to do, even if the aim of the practice is to like see through your nature as a human doing. But if you're not understanding it or coming from that context, I know like I've turned meditation into like an ego game in the past before, or like how spiritual I am or how woke I am. And I've sort of like to think that I've gotten past that, but I'm sure I fall into it here and there still. But that way of being, I think, is really, really powerful and takes a lot of awareness and commitment, because like you said, we live in a world that, for better or for worse, it's just much easier to define people in boxes. And I think it's culturally the case. And I think another thing that's coming to my mind is you have sort of had a lot of different lives. I mean, obviously you're still very young, but you've had a lot of lives in your young life in all these different areas. And I really resonated with what you said earlier about, I don't consider myself as a meditation teacher. Like I'm just here and that's the thing that I'm doing. At the same time, though, like you have had moments in your life where you've conclusively said, okay, I'm no longer doing that. Like whether it was walking away from OWSLA, or I know when we were speaking in Spain, you had mentioned your old company you left after doing this training. How do you know, or in the past at least, how have you known that the cycle of something that was once really engaging or exciting to you is over or transitioning?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would start with the word know, right? Like, how do you know anything? I think we tend to associate that word with cerebral or cognitive qualities, right? Like we think like we know things in our mind. The mind is not what knows things. The mind is like this, like when I say the mind, I mean like the small self intellect. That's what figures out like simple stuff, like like where our car is parked and stuff like that. Knowing, real knowing, capital K, knowing comes from the heart. It comes from a place that's bigger than the small self mind. And it's about, for me, this was actually a really difficult process because I used to be a big overthinker, and I would really get in my head about like, well, what should I do? Should I do this? Should I do that? Before leaving the label, I was feeling like maybe I should make a change for a couple of years at least. Not that I knew that I needed to make a change, just that I knew I wasn't feeling good. And like that's it right there, feeling. And I was trying to intellectualize it, and I wasn't paying enough mind to feeling. I used to think of feeling as, something that was like just for girls, or just for like, sissies, like, oh, my feelings. But you have to learn to be attuned to your feelings and to make decisions from that place, not from a place of small self mind, because making decisions from small self mind is never going to bring you where you need to go, right? The heart knows where you need to go. Big self knows where you need to go. And so it's about, again, I come back to meditation, right? When we meditate, we step beyond the daily noise, and we step beyond, like, okay, maybe small self intellect thinks that I should stay at this job because the paycheck is really good, and because everyone thinks I'm really cool because I work here, and because I have, a cool lifestyle on paper that comes with working here. But like, you're lying to yourself, right? It's these stories that the mind makes up to try to rationalize a thing, but it's not actually what we want, what we need, right? Nature knows what we need, and we are one with nature. And if we can de excite the mind, if we can step beyond that daily noise, and we can learn to attune ourselves and listen and be aware for what we're feeling in our heart, that's the real desire that nature has implanted there, that nature wants for us. And it may not make sense intellectually at first. Like when I left the first label, I had no backup plan. I had no other job. I had no other source of funding, nothing. But my dad, who's a big, intellect kind of person, was like begging me, like, please, just if you want to leave, that's fine. But, get something else lined up first, have some kind of plan, save some money. Like, what are you going to do? And I was like, I don't know, but I know I got to leave. And I just did it. And that was the right move. And when you follow your heart, when you follow the desire that nature has put in your heart, nature organizes itself in unbelievable ways to support you. Like shortly thereafter that, I got connected with my current partner, Ben Turner, who started the Arete wellness platform with me. in 2018. And he, Ben founded the IMS, the International Music Summit. And Ben just said, look, like I want to make wellness part of IMS. And, would you want to partner with me 50-50 and start a whole platform on it? We have some sponsorship dollars that you can play with. And, boom, that was it. Now I had a platform. And obviously I couldn't have seen that coming, but it came because I followed my heart. I followed the desire that nature itself had implanted in my heart. And nature was like, okay, cool. Like, you're getting it now. So we're going to help you out a little bit.
Do you think taking the leap is a necessary part of that process? I mean, maybe that is the process that you're describing, but I guess what I'm asking is, you had mentioned, for a couple years before, when you were still at OWSLA, you were having those feelings like something's not right. I don't know what it is, but something's off here, or I'm not fully in alignment. But it took that time, and I can so relate with that, because I feel like that about music like every other day, but that's just like a lot of artists can probably relate to that. But like, yeah. So, do you think that part of it is taking the leap, like almost affirming to the universe, like you have to prove your trust, you know what I mean? Kind of a thing. And then the thing shows up, because I guess it's just, that can feel like a very tough, courageous act, or like a scary way to live, especially in the world that we're brought up in, which is, especially even in like self-development circles, so much about goals and manifesting. And we had a really great conversation about manifesting that I want to get into later as well. But yeah, I guess the question is, do you feel like sort of burning the bridges is a necessary part of the process, or was for you?
I wouldn't say I burned any bridges. I hope I didn't.
Or not burning the bridges, sorry, burning the boats.
Taking the leap. I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I meant burning the boats.
Yeah. Right. You have, I think, as I was just saying, sometimes the feeling that you have in your heart, it maybe doesn't make sense. And it is a bit of a leap, you have to go with your gut. And I'm not saying everyone should just like quit their jobs right now and just, like whatever, like, for some people, it looks like building a project on the side slowly and then letting that, develop. But even that is a leap in and of itself. Like, yes, you have to take risks if you want a big reward. That old saying, right? Like, if you want a new experience, you have to try something new. And that can be scary and that can be uncomfortable at first, but it is, I think, definitely a necessary ingredient to moving towards authenticity and towards evolution, right? You're never going to evolve by just staying and doing the same thing all the time.
Totally. Yes. And speaking of taking a leap of faith into doing something new, I would love, I know you've probably talked about this so many times, but I think it would be really valuable, even briefly, to describe your experience training in Vedic meditation to become a teacher in India earlier this year, and sort of how that journey began for you. I know it began earlier than that, a couple years earlier, but how that journey began, what the process was like deciding to actually take the jump and make that trip, which is a really big commitment, and how it feels like to be out on the other end of it.
Yeah. It was by far like the most intense thing I've done in my life. You're talking about almost 2 years of prerequisites and preparing. During the better part of the pandemic, I was at home taking courses in advanced, Vedic knowledge and Sanskrit. Just the prerequisites are almost 300 hours, which I think is what a lot of yoga teachers have done total. Like that's just the prereqs for this. And then, if you're lucky enough to be one of the 10 or 20 people from around the world that are selected each year to do the in-person training, you're talking about another, 2,500 hours, basically about 100 days of almost round the clock, training. And without saying too much, it is, I guess, akin to some kind of combination of like Sanskrit grad school mixed with military boot camp, mixed with like a little bit of like spiritual teacher training in there. But the idea of the training is, like anyone can memorize some stuff and follow like a procedure and a protocol. But the idea with this particular training, right? I trained with Thom Knowles, who for 30 years was the right hand guy to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the world famous Indian guru who's known with having, trained the Beatles, the Pharaoh sisters, the Beach Boys, Donovan. Like when you see those famous photos of John Lennon and Paul McCartney and them in India in the 60s, like they were with Maharishi, right? Most people know who Maharishi is. Thom was his right-hand guy for 30 years. Thom today does an incredible job of maintaining the purity of the teaching exactly the same way that Maharishi taught. So exactly the same way that the previous Maharishi trained teachers, that's how Thom trains teachers today. He cuts no corners. There's nothing is done over Zoom. Nothing is virtual. There's no like quick weekend course. No corners are cut. It's the full, exactly the same way that Maharishi was training people. That's what Thom puts his teachers through. And the idea is that the medium is the message, right? The idea is that, it's not about what kind of information or knowledge you've memorized. It's about who you are. You can be spitting all this, like insane, like Vedic knowledge. But if you're like a really nervous, angry, anxious, whatever, weird kind of person, people don't care and they're not going to want to be inspired to learn from you. Whereas conversely, if you're someone who exudes and embodies the knowledge, then it doesn't really matter what you're saying because people can see that there's something there that you possess that they don't and they want that. And so that's what most of the training is about. It's I'm not going to lie, it's incredibly difficult. It was the hardest thing I've ever done and also the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And having done that has been incredibly fruitful for me. Since I've graduated from the program, I have noticed immense support from nature. I have noticed that, you know, things seem to organize for me and things seem to sort of flow. And I've been blessed. My teaching career has been incredibly fruitful so far. And it feels amazing to be sharing this knowledge. And it feels amazing to be helping people.
That's beautiful, man. I really love the way that you described that in terms of nature coming and supporting you, because I feel like so often, and we talked about this when we were speaking in person a couple months ago, we were talking about manifestation. I don't know if you remember, but I was asking you, like, do you have a manifestation practice? And you said something that really stuck with me. You said, well, I mean, your desire, the Vedic belief is that your desires, your real true soul desires, like not the ego based ones, but the real true ones that you feel in your heart and your body, they're just a preview of what nature has in store for you. So you just need to relax and embody that, and those desires will come to you. And that really, for me personally, since we had that conversation, has actually really changed my practice, where I've started seeing how even just by having and I'm not saying like people who have a manifestation practice, if it's whatever's working for someone, like, keep doing that. This is just my opinion. But I've noticed, like, yeah, a lot of my manifestation practice was still tinged with this energy of striving. Right. And like this energy of like, okay, I need to sit here and make sure that I'm embodying the feeling that it's going to feel like when I'm there. I just turned it into a whole other like effort, not a right effort, but like a strain. And I think that practice of embodying what it is that you're here to, the medicine that you're here to serve, like whether you're an artist or you're an accountant or a meditation, like whatever it is that you do, and trusting that nature or the universe, whatever you want to call it, will meet you halfway. I know, like for me, it's still like such a challenge. I mean, I like to think that I'm getting better at it, but it's really cool to hear you talk about it in those terms. And it kind of leads me to something I'm curious about, which is, so I guess like, you could say that one of the most important things is for you as a meditation teacher to be sort of embodying this wisdom that you teach. Do you find a challenge, now with everything that all the experiences you've had and all the different careers that you've had now in present day, do you ever find it challenging to stay in that embodied place, but then still carry out the business of like going out there and getting clients and things like that? Because I know for myself, as much as I practice and try to be in that place, there's certain tasks that just like, they just bring me out of it, right? Like being on email for too long or whatever. And I want to trust in the universe enough to be like, I'm just literally going to commit to doing that and everything will get taken care of. But I don't know if maybe that's naive or I just don't have that level of trust. So I'm curious, in your experience, I mean, like, how do you balance those two things? Or am I thinking about it wrong and it's not about balancing them?
I mean, look, I can't tell anyone else how to run their business, but maybe I can share what's happened to me and how I think of things. And if people find that inspiring, then more power to them. I have spent very little time and energy and effort getting clients or attracting clients. This is part of what I mean by nature supporting, right? I do almost no marketing. or promotion of myself, save for every now and then sharing on Instagram, like what dates I'll be in what city. I have found myself teaching almost every single day in the last, 2 or 3 months since I completed the training. And I don't take any credit for that, right? That's nature, right? That's nature organizing. Nature knows that people need meditation. And one of the biggest needs of the time is for people to learn to meditate. And I've become a vessel to facilitate that, right? So nature is supporting that. I'm in cahoots with nature now because I've made myself a vessel for this evolutionary purpose. But, from the Vedic perspective, and maybe this is unique to other industries, but it's not about quantity. It's not about chasing clients. It's not about teaching as many people as we can. As I say on my website, right, the Vedic meditation experience is the hi-fi, vinyl record on analog floor standing, speakers in your house with a perfectly acoustically trained room experience. And not everyone wants or needs or is ready for that. So for me to be out, like running Google ads or like networking or like trying to drum up business, I'd be catching a lot of, fish with that net who are maybe, half ready. Maybe they're like a little bit into meditation. And so they like, responded to the ad, but they're like not fully ready yet. And so by contrast, the idea, as Vedic teachers, because the experience that we offer is so deep, our philosophy is more that we let people find us, right? And people find us when the time is right. I mean, I just had a course here in LA this week where the one of the students said, I don't know like how I found you. Like, my brother was asking me like what made me all of a sudden decide that right now was the time that I wanted to learn and that you were the person I wanted to learn with, because I had never had any interaction with this person before. And he just said, well, I had been following you on Instagram for a while. And one day in the feed, just happened to put, one of your posts about your courses in front of me. And I kind of even forgot who you were or why I was following you because we had never spoken and I had followed you a long time ago. But I just saw this post one day from you. And it just kind of like I had, meditation had been on my mind and it was something that I had wanted to do. And so I just said, maybe this is a sign that now is the time to do this. And so he did it. And so that to me is a beautiful example, right? Of like nature organized that to happen. I didn't have to do anything. It's just, we don't give enough credit to nature, the organizing power that nature has to make things like this happen. We're out there thinking that we need to make things happen, that we need to like make the universe run and make things and will certain things in our life to happen. And we don't, they're already happening. It's already in motion. Evolution is already in motion. Nature is already organizing it. What we have to do, our responsibility is to attune to that awareness, that big self desire of, what we're meant to be doing and what moves we're meant to be taking. And then just sort of go with the flow. It's an age old expression that I think has lost a lot of its meaning, but literally go with the flow and follow, what it is that you feel.
You're in cahoots with nature. So because the thing that you're doing is genuinely like good for the world, it's like nature is now going to conspire to help you. And sometimes I wonder, like, I think that's a huge point because I think about that sometimes with art. It's like, okay, yeah, music is amazing. Obviously, like it can have an incredible impact on people's lives. But there's a lot of other things that go with the music that can kind of like sully the intentions of people, in the industry, whether you're an artist or someone else and you start doing it for the wrong reason. And then maybe, yeah, I don't know, maybe you do start losing support from nature because it's like you've kind of lost that intention to be of service.
Yeah, like why are you doing it?
Yeah.
Are you doing it because you want to be famous or make a lot of money? Would you still be doing it if there were no money in it? Would you be doing it for free? If someone said to you, hey, you're never going to make a dime doing this, but all your expenses will be covered and you'll never have to pay anything either, would you take that deal? And this is where we get into, I'm blanking on the name of the researcher now, but there's been some brilliant research done into the idea of intrinsic rewards as opposed to extrinsic rewards, right? So, like, are you doing it because it inherently makes you happy? Or are you doing it for some external validation in the form of, a certain chart position or a certain amount of record sales or a certain, whatever? And that's how we tend to think of success today, right? It's like, oh, well, if I could just get this, or if I could just get on that playlist. Playlists are the biggest one now. It's like, this is how artists think of success. And it's such a joke, right? I mean, like Spotify has engineered this whole ecosystem where like they are kingmakers because they can put, people on playlists. And it's kind of a joke, like those things aren't success, because I've talked to every artist who's attained those things, and they're not happy because of those things. That happiness is fleeting, right? That happiness is always going to be fleeting. Like, it has to be about doing something that you love, and that in and of itself is the reward. You're playing a musical instrument because you love playing that instrument, and you're rewarded from playing that instrument, and then boom, you've already won. If you're doing something you love for the sake of doing it, you have absolutely already won. And anything else on top of that is just gravy. That's how you have to look at it.
Yeah, 100%, man. I mean, it's the playlist thing is like I just want to make a quick addition there. Like for any artists out there listening, I mean, first of all, let me just caveat by saying I still want to get on playlists. Like it's still strategically good to want to get on playlists. So I'm not saying like stop wanting to get on playlists, but as someone who did get on a bunch of playlists and then a couple years later wasn't on those playlists, it was totally depressing. It was I reached this goal and then it was just this huge peak and then it subsided. And I think the other thing for me that started disillusioning me to that sort of model of success that, as you mentioned, Blaise, is so kind of pernicious in our society is I think the reason that it feels good, or in the short term, it can feel like, oh, that's what I want, is it strengthens the ego in the short term, in the sense that if you are on this playlist, the reason it's valuable to be on the playlist is because there's a bunch of people that aren't on it. Right. So it's that's the reason it's because of the scarcity. It's if everybody was on Rap Caviar, it would lose all of its value. It's the fact that there are only this many spots and there's only one of this artist and you're right next to him or you're right below him or above him or whatever. And that sort of way of quantifying success or happiness, I think ultimately leads to a deep sense of existential sadness and depression, because it's basically just reinforcing the illusion of separation. And I know for me, that's been a huge and continues to be a huge thing that I deal with, because of course, on one hand, as an artist, I want to have success. I want to be able to have a career. I do think that I've chipped away pretty much altogether at the notion that it's a competition. I think I kind of grew up with that, but I think I've done enough work now where if I start having those thoughts, I have the mindfulness to become aware of it and just see it for the inner child that it is, crying out for my love, and just take care of it internally instead of projecting it onto the world. But still, there's still a part of me that wants that success and wants to feel like the man who's on stage at Coachella or whatever. And I always notice the nature of that. It's just, it immediately creates this tension that is setting me up for the joy of the release. The joy of achieving it will then be the release of the tension, if that makes sense. Where whenever I'm deeply connecting with people, or I'm deeply connected to the song that I'm making, I'm just so deeply connected that the boundary between the creator and what's being created is lost, and there's just creation happening through me. Those moments are just total bliss, because it's a remembrance of the oneness. It's a remembrance of that lack of separation. And I think it's so important to continue to have these conversations forever and continue to push this, because the fact is we do really live in a culture that subconsciously celebrates that separation. I mean, that's what quote unquote success basically implies, is you're here and you're successful because you're in comparison to all these other people that don't have that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I like how you made that connection about the non-duality. It's really, yeah, it's really not about that. That's an ego need. Then that's a need. That's a 13-year-old. It's called in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, it's called a differentiation need, right? The need to be perceived as good at something. But it's really not about that, man. It's about doing it because you love it. And there's a lot of artists who have really truly figured that out, right? And they're so happy. And they're typically not the artists who you've heard of and who are occupying the Billboard charts and things like that. They're typically artists who have a following, are making some money touring, have a small but dedicated fan base, and who are making music that pleases them because making it pleases them. And that's it. And they're not millionaires, and they don't live in mansions. They live in Highland Park mostly, and they're happy. They're really happy because they're authentic. And those people, the difference there, those people are following soul desires as opposed to ego desires. An example of a soul desire is it makes me happy to play the guitar. So I'm going to play the guitar. Boom, now I'm happy. Ego desire comes in, and it's like, well, I want to be famous for playing the guitar, and I want to have this many records sold, and I want to have this, I want to have this many chart positions and things like that. And those things, while it's, there's nothing wrong with, having goals, when we attach our happiness to those things, I think that can be very dangerous.
Yeah.
Because those things are fleeting, as I said before.
Totally. You mentioned goals. It's funny because I've been having this like major shift, and I think you'll appreciate it because it reminds me of our conversation about manifestation, where I actually just decided, Blaise, like almost not even like a week ago, actually. So this is, you're like the first person I'm publicly talking to about this. I actually decided to just like throw away all my goals like a few days ago.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I've just been like in this, and also that my last podcast on this show was with Sasha Cobra, who's an incredible woman and my Tantra teacher for many years, a couple of years. And we were talking about it as well. And she was saying very similar things to what you're saying. And it had been on my mind a lot, how this attachment to these goals and these things that I want to quote unquote manifest is so much more mental than it is heart-based. And I realized that when I noticed myself waking up in the morning and looking at my vision board or closing my eyes to think about what it would be like to be on stage at whatever festival and feeling nothing, just feeling like I needed to force the emotion, right? And that's friction there. It's like, you shouldn't need to force what your soul's true desire is. It should just be naturally coming out of you. And once I started getting aware of that, I was like, actually, it doesn't really matter. I actually don't really care about the goals themselves. They're just sort of like these mental addictions that I have that, like you mentioned, are driven by ego or driven by these other things that are actually taking me away from the fact that in this moment right now, I could be doing something that makes me feel good. Maybe that's meditating. Maybe that's producing music. Maybe that's just like sitting and doing nothing. But meanwhile, I'm in this moment saying that I'm doing my spiritual practice, right? Like it's like part of my morning routine to do my manifestation. But the actual emotional signature of that moment, that experience in that moment is not pleasant. It's like, so like, what's the point? I just had this like moment and I was like, okay, I'm just going to commit now to doing the things that feel in alignment. And I want to make a distinction here because I know I've fallen into this trap. So hopefully, for people listening, I do think that there's a difference between what's in alignment and what always feels the most pleasurable or most comfortable. Because, sometimes doing things in alignment can be uncomfortable. Like I just signed up to go do this 1 month long Tantra teacher training in Thailand. It starts in August. And it's completely out of line with any of my logical ego-based goals about like being a big artist. It actually doesn't really make any sense at all, like logically. And my parents are like, I just moved back home. I've been living at my parents' house for the last 3 months working on music. And now I'm like, I'm going to go do this thing. And they're like, so are you going to become a Tantra teacher? And I'm like, honestly, I don't know. And then they're just like face palm, like they're just like no direction. Like what is going on?
I want to know what that conversation has been like, explaining Tantra to your parents.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the most common, it's not just my parents. I think Tantra kind of has its own like reputation because of the sex thing, but
right. Obviously it's not that. Yeah.
Right. Like that's the most common sentence that comes out of my mouth, like to anyone, to my parents for sure, but really pretty much anyone that asks is like, well, Tantra is just like 1% of it's about sex. And like, I'm just so used to kind of prefacing it with that. But in terms of the conversation with my parents, I mean, I think I've just tried to be as vulnerable and honest with them as I can, the same way that I am right now, which is that this constant striving for success or this constant desire to know my purpose, right? To know like my path. And because it's like, we hear that so much. And especially I don't think it's actually as big of a thing anymore because gender roles are so much more like neutralized now. But I know for myself, like as a man too, it's like, it's a huge part of like my masculine desire is to have a purpose and like know where I'm going, know my direction. Like that's a really important part of just like feeling like a man, at least culturally that's been programmed into me. And so it's been difficult to let go of that, but I realized like this constant need to know what my purpose is and like have a neat little answer that I can give to people at parties when they ask me like what I'm doing. It's like, oh, well, I just played this festival and I have that, like, instead of just being like, I don't know. And like being able to sit in that social discomfort, that has been a huge challenge for me. And I just intuitively feel like I need to lean into that, not for the sake of leaning in, just challenging myself for no reason, but because this Tantra teacher training opportunity came up. I felt in my body like this is something I wanted to do. And I sat down and made a pros and cons list. And all of the pros were like, oh, it's going to connect me closer to my heart. Like, even if I leave and don't decide to do it, like, think about how much better of an artist I'll be because I'll be that much more connected to source and spirit. Like, all these beautiful pros. And every single con was fear based. There was like no con that was actually based in reality. It was all like, well, what if you come back and you don't want to make music anymore? And it's like, or what if you run out of money because this is like a good chunk of my net worth right now to go do this course. So all those things, and I'm really in the practice now of just surrendering to that desire and trusting, like you said earlier, that nature will meet me halfway if I do my job of just staying in alignment, but it's just hard. It's a tricky thing for sure.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, I commend you for going with your feeling there. And it's funny you mentioned you did the pros and cons list, but I know you're a very smart guy and you are always looking to learn and evolve. And so I would be willing to venture a bet that next time you are faced with a decision like this, you probably won't even bother with the pros and cons list, and you'll probably just go straight with what you were feeling, because it seems like you figured out this time that that's where if you're true to yourself, that's where you're going to end up anyway. The pros and cons list is kind of just like, I don't know. So you can feel like you thought it through, but I think in the West, we place way too much importance on thinking it through. Like, we're not going to think our way to anything. We didn't think our way to where we are now. Like, every good idea, every profound idea and creation we've ever had has just come to us, right? It's come to us in the shower. It's come to us when we're driving. Like, we don't actually think up anything. The small self mind and intellect is actually like incredibly, well, it's incredibly helpful when it comes to certain things, keeping us alive, for example, right? Like, we remember that little red sign on the crosswalk means don't walk. And so we don't walk in front of the street. We don't get hit by a bus, right? The mind is great for that. But when it comes to, big picture decisions, we've got to listen to the heart. We've got to listen to what we feel in our gut, in our heart, all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And that's a lifelong practice. And it's also like an unlearning practice. But, I think the beautiful thing there is that we are living in a paradigm where more and more people, I feel, are ready for this way of living and this way of existing. And, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think it's like we mentioned earlier, the more that you can surround yourself with people that you don't need to justify that way of living to because they get it, the easier and more natural it becomes. And I know that's one of the reasons that I'm so grateful that you're in my life, because I feel like I don't need to explain these things to you. Like, you just get them and you're sort of on that same level. And I think that that's the power of community. So yeah, man, I think maybe that's a good way to wrap, is just thank you so much for being you and being a part of my life. And you're a huge inspiration to me, especially I have to say, like, this journey that you've just been on to become a Vedic meditation teacher. I really was thinking about you a lot as I was making my own decision to go do this teacher training and just kind of weighing the pros and cons. So I just want to thank you for being in my life and inspiring me.
Wow, man, that really means a lot. Thank you. And I feel the same way about you. I've told countless people about our conversation in Ibiza, about your, the challenge you sort of gave yourself to make. I think, was it 50 tracks in 50 days or 100 tracks in 100 days?
100, yeah.
Yeah. And like the one pointed intention and the single minded sort of dedication, that's so rare. And that's so incredible that I was literally just telling my friend at dinner last night about that.
Amazing.
So, right back at you, my brother.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. Well, hopefully we get to hang soon. I can give you a big hug. But yeah, before we wrap, I have a final question, Blaise, that I ask all my guests, and I'm dying to know your answer. So the question is, what makes you feel the most free?
Whew, having all my stuff in this one suitcase that's right in front of me, that's small enough to carry on anywhere in the world and not needing anything else.
That is amazing. I felt that. I felt that in my body. That's incredible.
Can go wherever I want.
I love it, man. Well, Blaise, thank you so much. I'm going to link to your website and your Instagram and everything in the show notes. If you guys are interested in learning about meditation or just learning more about Blaise, I highly recommend. He's a super talented teacher and just an amazing human being. But is there anywhere that you prefer, people reach out if they want to find out more, Blaise?
Yeah, Instagram's really the only thing that I really use. So yeah, hit me up there. I have a website where you can learn all about Vedic meditation and what it is, why it's so special, how it's different from other forms of meditation. Most people, who I've spoken to have tried meditation, not had a good experience. You can learn and understand why that is, why you've probably not had good experiences with other types of meditation, and why Vedic meditation is different. You can learn what the course is like, what the process is like to learn. And you can read a little bit about my story as well and sort of what drew me here from my background in the music industry to now teaching meditation to mostly those also in the industry. So Instagram, website. Yeah. Thanks, Ashish.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. This is incredible. I love you, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Sacred Giggle podcast with Blaise James. If you want to learn more about Blaise, if you want to learn meditation from him, I've included his Instagram and website in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to hear more, be sure to hit subscribe or follow on whatever device or platform you're using to listen to this. And if you really love the show and want to help us out, give us some good juju, you can leave us a 5-star review, which will help us in the rankings so more people can discover these incredibly powerful conversations. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you soon. Peace.